Recording.
Okay, thank you, Julia. Thank you for the invitation. It's really, as everyone else would say, it's a new format and it's my first presentation in a few months. So I was very excited before this talk. For those who don't know me, I'm currently at working as a research fellow at Center for Longitudinal Studies at UCL. And I'm presenting a paper which was one of my last PhD papers. My PhD thesis was about transition to adulthood in England and Wales, the analysis of life trajectories of young adults, which I did at the University of Liverpool and defended last year. So in general, when we start talking about transition to adulthood, there's different perceptions and there are different approaches how we can define when a young person becomes an adult. So there are major, kind of like two large approaches how we could think about that. One would be something which is closer towards developmental psychology and emerging adulthood concept, where we take into account the feelings of and perceptions of young people, how when they think they become adults. And another one is more demographic perspective, which is age-specific event-based approach. And we know from the classical literature that the concept has been modified a few times, but the major concepts still involve leaving the parental home, completion of education, entry into the labor market, or gaining financial independence from parents, and first cohabitation, marriage, or first parenthood. And when we think about young adults today, we know that there is a lot of boomeranging going back, like boomeranging among young adults, meaning that young adults moving back with their parents. There's a lot of separation among first cohabiting unions, and completing of education is not a single transition anymore. So there is longer spells of time spent in education. And when I started my dissertation, I also thought like, well, we're doing PhD. This is something that is still considered being in education, but it's being paid for. So therefore, this is an entry into labor market. So it all got me thinking about moving towards the trajectories. And yet there's the approach that I took in my dissertation was looking at different trajectories instead of single events. And thus I looked at housing and moving trajectories, at education and employment trajectories, which I'm talking about today in detail, and partnership and family trajectories. So 3 trajectories and 3 major dimensions, which I looked at in my dissertation, and I will explain further on like why they're so interesting. So these dimensions are birth, cohort, gender, and parental socio-economic background. And to move towards the British pattern of the transition to adulthood, the British pattern is usually described as accelerated one with early transition from school to work. And then there is a quote from the paper which stems from open labor market relationships and flexible education and training system, which in simple terms would mean that the British youth had positive expectations of finding a job straight after school, and that's been a common pattern for a few generations, and yet this is where the accelerated pattern comes from. And the other part of the equation of the British pattern of the transition to adulthood is that it's followed by heterogeneous household and family formation, and they differ by race, ethnicity, gender, and parental background. So when we think about young people today, this slide is called Freedom of Choice in the Times of Economic Precarity. So if we think about the last few decades, there is a lot of discussion about how transition to adulthood has become destandardized and individualized, meaning that the timing and the sequence of the events has changed. The common patterns which were prevalent before are gone. And there's a decrease in the normative control in the society, which resulted in the, for example, public acceptance of non-marital cohabitation, the emergence of living apart together relationships, the introduction of civil partnerships and same-sex marriages, the expansion of higher education, which is usually associated with better labor market outcomes and kind of larger flexibility in life. So on the left-hand side, we have larger freedom of lifestyle choices. And on the right-hand side, we have a box which describes the economic and housing crisis, which young people in the last couple of decades were facing. And that resulted in the increased rate of unemployment, the low affordability of housing, the retrenchment of welfare benefits, specifically in the UK. So we're kind of like, we're thinking about this freedom of choice and decreased normative control. And on the other hand, we have these structural constraints and economic precarity. And therefore, when we think about the birth cohorts, and specifically among those who started their transitions here after the 1990s, and thus were born between 1974 and 1990, on the one hand, there could be a relatively homogeneous group of people compared to the older cohorts, which were forerunners of the second demographic transition. But on the other hand, there is this precarity, and thus investigating life course trajectories by 5-year birth cohorts gives us an advantage of unraveling the microsocial change occurring in the transition to adulthood over the last 25 years. The next dimension I'm looking at and interested in is gender, and yet we know that since the second demographic transition, there's been an increased feminization of higher education and labor of higher education and the labor market. And there is certain evidence and papers which talk about the convergence of women's and men's life course trajectories, especially in the early stage of the life course. And that could be internal migration trajectories, as I show in another paper from my dissertation. And there could be some similarities in living in the parental home patterns. But yet we know that there is the other strong argument that gender pay gaps still exist, and the disadvantaged labor market position of women later in life still exists. And for example, in another paper that we worked on last year, we looked at the employment trajectories of mothers in the UK, and 30% of first-time mothers in the UK in 2013 stayed out of the labor force within the first 5 years after childbirth. And what is interesting, that a quarter of them have never had a full-time job since they turned 16. So therefore, we think about, is there something different in females' employment trajectories? And since we have an opportunity, and this is what I'm interested in this paper, to start looking at them since the age of 16. So can we actually capture where this precarity starts, and why does it start? So therefore, on the one hand, we have convergence of life trajectories. On the other hand, we have persistence of gender differences in employment, education, careers. The last dimension is, of course, a parental socioeconomic background. So as discussed, there's the argument about destandardization and positive individualization of life course trajectories, and increased flexibility, which allows for greater variation in choices, in timing. But is it really one solution for all? And in the British literature about education and transition to adulthood, there's been a long discussion about the youth divide, the so-called youth divide, which is the polarization between advantaged and the disadvantaged, and the existence of so-called fast and slow tracks in the transition to adulthood. And to talk a little bit more about what is the fast track. The fast track is usually considered to be followed by young adults from less advantaged backgrounds, and yet they transition to labor force, they enter the labor markets quicker on, earlier on, they have children earlier on, they form partnerships, and they don't necessarily continue their education. And the slow track is usually considered to be followed by those from more advantaged backgrounds, and yet for people who can enjoy the flexibility, enjoy the range of opportunities open in life, and spending more time in higher education, and postponing entering the first cohabitation and having children. So the argument is still there. So what do we see actually among the youngest cohort? Is it the structured individualization, or is it more opportunity for people from less advantaged backgrounds to actually benefit from this flexibility? And just a little bit about the context before I move to my research questions. So we talk about the cohorts who started transitioning to adulthood since the 1990s. And since the 1970s, 80s, there's been a restructuring of the labor market. So there's a lot of literature that discuss polarization between highly skilled professional occupations and low-skilled equilibrium. So this is something that I mentioned, that the demand for the service jobs has increased, and yet that forced the demand for highly educated workforce. And yet we know that the concept of a job for life is already gone, and there's a prevalence of new labor market conditions such as temporary and 0 hours contract. And then we know that there's been expansion of higher education, and I'll show it on the next slide now and then come back to this one. So on this slide, we see how the participation in higher education in Britain has changed between 1979 and 2014. And we know that it has increased from 12% in 1979 to almost 30% in the beginning of the 1990s. And the latest stats say, according to latest statistics, it's around 49% of graduates, high school graduates, actually continue some kind of further or higher education. So these changes has been dramatic, but they also have led to a skill mismatch and overqualification problems, and yet meaning that more people go into higher education, but it doesn't necessarily mean that their returns to education would be as high as they used to be, because there's many more degrees and there are many more people. So the question is like whether this has changed over cohorts, and whether actually we still see that the returns to higher education are as high as they used to be. And on the other hand, this mismatch and overqualification has also led to the increase in youth unemployment and people out of labor force, those who don't want to take, who are forced to be out of labor force, or who don't want to take temporary jobs and yet register as unemployed or be dragged into low pay, no pay cycles. So what we observe is, it leads us to the question, is this actually, we're talking about more turbulent, individualized, protracted transitions, or whether we could see some new patterns emerge from this new flexibility and flexible arrangements. So I had another slide about unemployment among young people. So it's been fairly lower than in the rest of the well, it's at the same level on average in the European Union for the period, and much lower than, for example, in the Mediterranean countries, but much higher than in the Nordic countries. And there's been some fluctuations. So we're talking about the cohorts, once again, who entered the labor market between 1990s and like 2015. So there would be years where the labor market looked slightly more positive, but hasn't been that much variation. So which leads us to the research questions of this paper. So how educational employment trajectories, which is the same thing as school to work pathways, or I will be calling them differently, but I'm talking about the same thing. So how have educational employment trajectories changed since the rapid expansion of further and higher education in the beginning of 90s? Then the second part of the paper is related to your occupational outcomes 10 years after completing compulsory education. So whether we see what is the association between the school to work trajectories and occupational outcomes later on. And the last part actually tackles the returns to education, and thus looks into how educational outcomes differ by level of education with regards to cohort, gender, and parental socioeconomic background. So a couple of words about the data and sample that I'm using. Using the combined data from British Household Panel Survey and Understanding Society. I think that many of you know about the BHPS and Understanding Society, and BHPS started in 1991 with a representative sample of more than 10,000 households in the UK. And Understanding Society followed the same people from British Households Panel Survey, but also extended the sample a lot. But people who I'm looking at, this is the sample that originally started in BHPS. And why this is important is because all of these people, we would know their background characteristics because they either have entered the study at the age of 16 in 1991, or otherwise they were part of the so-called Rising 16 sample. So those are children who are, well, children in the household, or young people who were present in the household before the age 16. And then when they grow up and they enter the when they become eligible for full-time personal individual interview, we would know their background, and we would know the region where we observed them, the region where their parents, where they were living at the age of 14, 15, 16, and we would know more information about their parents, because information about parents that is collected retrospectively later on, for example, has a lot of missings on the parental background. And yet, in our case, we don't only observe, we don't only use these variables, but we could actually go and trace the parents at the wave when the children were 14, 15, or 16, and take the necessary characteristics from there. So what you see on the left-hand side is a representation of the sample of the Lexis diagram. And I hope that perfectionists and database people can forgive me for the unequal intervals on the timeline. But the major point, what I wanted to show here is, so when those cohorts become representative, when they join the sample that I'm looking at, and that's from 2008 until 2019. This sample was followed in understanding society. Not everyone, of course, but we followed quite a large number of people. And therefore, the analysis that I'm presenting today is actually the updated analysis for the latest 9th wave, which was taking place between 2017 and 2019. So it's very fresh data. And the final sample for the analysis consists of 3 cohorts, as I mentioned, and that's a fairly even sample size. So we have over 600 people in each cohort, and they're quite equally distributed by all other major characteristics that I've mentioned. So the method that I will be using in this paper is a combination of sequence analysis and multinomial logistic regression. And just to say a few words about the sequence analysis. So sequence analysis is looks at individual data. So what we do is we transform all the data that we have in Understanding Society and BHPS and create the monthly spells of monthly employment spells. So what you see in the middle of this slide is the example from the data. So this is the actual 120 months of the actual 6 people. These are actually the meadows of the clusters, but these are the actual people in the data. So for example, if you look at the first line, we see that someone has spent 24 months being in education, and then they spent the rest of the time being full-time employed. Person number 2 was juggling between full-time and part-time education. So they started spending 24 months in education, then a few months in full-time employment, then swapping to part-time employment, then going back into full-time employment, then swapping back to part-time employment. And so this is what we observe for almost 1,900 individuals. So, and in order to make this comparable and to group somehow these sequences, there exist a number of methods how to measure the distances between these sequences. And the one that we are following in this paper is called the dynamic Hamming distance. And the difference of the dynamic Hamming distance. So basically what you can do with these trajectories is you can normally, you can insert some of the spells, you can delete some of the spells, and you can substitute one for another. And the dynamic Hamming distance pays particular attention to the timing of the transitions. And this, so this kind of like the costs are derived from the substitution costs are actually derived from the actual data, and they're not fixed. And why we follow this approach is because, for example, if you look at these 2 graphs that I have here, so on the left-hand side, you see that time, this is the months since 2016. So we have 120 months in our sequences. And this is time spent in full-time education. So we see that nearly everyone starts in full-time education. The proportion of people in full-time education decreases over time. And next to it, we see that transition rate to leaving the full-time education and entering the full-time employment. And we see that this rate is not constant over time. And therefore, there are a few bumps which are associated with those who finished A-levels or some kind of apprenticeship or vocational training and entered the labor market. And there is the next big bump is the graduates, so those who actually entered the labor market after some kind of higher education degree. And because this does not stay constant over time, we follow in this dynamic Hamming distance approach. So for example, the whole data, so the transition matrix for the whole data would look like that. And this would all be implemented in the way how we measure the distances. And the next step after defining the distances and making them more similar is a way of how to cluster them together, and there are different ways of clustering mechanisms. So there is k-means and k-methods. Well, the major ones are k-means and k-methods clustering mechanisms. So we follow the k-method one because it's more, I don't have a slide about that, because it's more flexible towards the outliers. But to define the final number of the clusters, we followed different approaches. So we looked at the k-means towards hierarchy of clustering and looked at the natural breaks in the point, natural breaks in the data. And we looked at the pseudo-I and pseudo-F R-squared and pseudo-F discrepancy measures. And after that, we selected the number of clusters for the k-methods clustering, and we compared the COS of different number of clusters. So there is never a unique solution, but this is the one that we followed, and we actually came up with some meaningful clusters, in our opinion. It would be good to see whether you think the same. And the second part of the analysis looks at implementing this. So the first part is whether these school-to-work pathways are the outcomes, and we would see how background characteristics actually affect belonging to and following one or another school-to-work pathway. And the second part of the paper looks at the occupational outcomes at the age of 26, and thus we'll look at the NSSEC categories and distinguish between professional and managerial jobs, intermediate occupations, routine and manual occupations, and those who are still looking for a job or unemployed, and a little proportion of those who are still in education is sitting in this category as well. So once again, the first question is, how have education employment trajectories changed since the rapid expansion of education? And these are our clusters. So this is the 6 final clusters that emerged from the data. And so we distinguish between 7 economic activity statuses. So those are self-employed, full-time employed, part-time employed, unemployed or looking for a job. Also included a maternity and paternity leave variable there. Then full-time educational student, and those who are out of labor force. Those who are out of labor force is a combination of a group, mostly because we're talking about young people, so they're mostly filled by those who are looking after families, or there is a small proportion of those who are long-term sick or disabled. So what we see on the picture is quite colorful graphs, and the first one is what we call successful rapid school-to-work transitions. So these are the people who have spent some time in education, but then the vast majority of time they spend in full-time employment, and therefore we label them successful rapid school-to-work transitions. And the next one followed by was also part of this rapid school-to-work transition, but these are what we call precarious rapid school-to-work transition. So, and why we call it that way, because there's people who spent some time in education, but they actually wanted to enter the labor market, and they have, but they have not found a full-time job, and they've been juggling between part-time employment, time periods, and time spent in self-employment, and short-term full-time employment spells. So they are in the labor market, they're not out, but it is less successful when we think in classical terms of having a full-time job. But altogether, you see that the sum of the first and the second cluster is almost 50%. And yet this is the short question, the short answer to the question in the name of the paper: accelerated school-to-work transition still true? They are still true. But bear with me, there is more interesting stuff coming up. So the next cluster is the one which we called high education to full-time job, because the vast majority of people spend over 50-60 months in this cluster in education, meaning staying in education until the age of 21, 22. and then entering the labor market with kind of like a successful transition to full-time employment. The next two clusters are also related to time spent in further or higher education, but it's not necessarily a direct transition to full-time job. So the cluster number 4, which is 11% of people, is what we call higher education to uncertainty. Not necessarily higher education, but higher education in terms of longer time spent in education, and I should probably relabel that. And this is a cluster where young people actually spend some time in education, and longer time spent in education, also on average until the age of 2022. But their transition to labor market is a little bit less successful, and they also go through the cycle of unemployment, part-time jobs, self-employment in their journey until the age of 26. And the last two clusters are more straightforward. So cluster number 8 is something that is more prevalent among the youngest cohort, and these are the young people who spend more time in education. And there might even still be, so we see that half of them are still in some kind of education at the end of the observation periods, which is age 26. And there is a very important cluster of which we call the precarious one, the cycle of unemployment and inactivity, which covers 13% of the sample. And these are young people who actually spent a little bit of time in education since the age of 16, but their transition to labor market was not successful, and yet they were going through the times of periods of unemployment and and time of being out of labor force mostly. So, and what is alarming here that we're talking about 10 years since the age of 16, and within these 10 years, they could not find the way to find an established job trajectory. So, and this is potentially this low pay, no pay cycle. So on the next slide, I'm not going to focus on that, but this is how the index plot looks like. So this is actually how every life course trajectory of every individual stacks together. And we see that none of that trajectory, like that there's only very few of them which actually have, for example, 2 colors, as we would think of the perfect transition, for example, spend time in education and then in full-time job. So all of them are quite complex. The next question that we're looking at, so these are the most common patterns, but how do they differ by cohort, by gender, by parental background, so actually who is following which kind of trajectory? So this graph, so this is a combination of a few graphs, and I still didn't come up with a perfect solution of how to present these graphs. So this is something new, but if you can't understand it or you have better suggestion, please share it with me. So these are the marginal effects. So these are the outcomes of the multinomial logistic regression. And these are the marginal effects on 6 outcomes, probabilities from the models. So what we're interested here is we're comparing males and females. We're comparing young people from different parental backgrounds, from different cohorts, and also an important indicator that we're controlling for is the region of residence at the age of 16. So if we first look at the females versus males graph, so what it tells us, and so how we read the graph. So the full color patterns are those which refer to significant differences. So if we look at females, we see that on the left-hand side, so this is below 0, which means less likely, which means that the predicted probability of females following their successful rapid school-to-work transition is by 17 percentage points lower than those of males. But on the other hand, we see that women are more likely to follow the precarious rapid school-to-work transitions and also spend longer time in this precarious cycle of unemployment and inactivity. So this tells us something about the gender inequality and how the life course, so how employment education pathways between males and females differ. Then we move to your parental background, and so what we would expect and what we're interested in, we know that since the expansion of higher education and a success of the widening participation program, there's been a significant increase in young people from less advantaged backgrounds who would follow the higher education, who would go into further and higher education. And when we look at the proportions by cohorts in our data, that is also true. But what we see is when we control for all of other factors, we see that the gray color is refers to young people from parental background, which could be described as out of labor force or workless, which means that at the age of 14 to 16, both parents were out of labor force. So if only one parent was out of labor force, then we would take the occupation of another one. So we use the Goldthorpe's social class schema classification, and yet we distinguish between service class, which is professional and managerial occupations, intermediate class, which are usually as skilled occupations, and working class, which is manual, routine, and unskilled occupations. The last one is out of labor force, or workless pattern, where both parents were outside of labor market. So what we see here is the most striking difference are, of course, between those young people from the least advantaged backgrounds, and they're more likely to be stuck in this cycle of unemployment and inactivity, and they're way less likely to follow higher education to full-time job trajectory. And if we look at those from working class backgrounds, young people from working class backgrounds, so they also have, they're less likely to be stay longer in education, and also less likely to have a successful transition from higher education to full-time job. But they're more likely to follow the rapid school-to-work transitions, which tells us that parental background still plays an important role in how young people's school-to-work trajectories are defined at the moment. We gradually move to differences in the cohorts. So we, once again, to remind you, we'll look at 5-year birth cohorts, and yet some papers look at them together, and we see a significant difference to, for example, their parents' generation. But what is interesting here, and what's showed up in my other papers as well, that there is a difference. So the middle cohort is really following trends between the oldest and the youngest cohort. But the youngest cohort and the oldest cohort, so there's 10 age difference, like 10 to 15 years different age difference between them. And the patterns look fairly different. So we see here, for example, that they're way less likely to follow the successful rapid school-to-work transitions, but they're more likely to be in precarious school-to-work transitions. And they're more likely to follow this higher education to uncertainty rule, or stay longer in education, but they're less likely to have this successful transition. So in brief, what it tells us, we know that younger people spend longer time in education, but that does not necessarily mean that they have a successful entry into labor market afterwards. So, which poses further questions to the returns of higher education and this mismatch of skills and overqualification on the labor market. So, and that is very interesting dimension. So we see that even within these three birth cohorts, the very youngest cohorts is spending more time in education, but also is experiencing more turbulences in the career, with longer time spent outside of labor markets, or being self-employed or part-time employed. And I'll skip the region for now, but happy to take it forward so that we have more time for questions later. So the natural question is, since I call some of the trajectories higher education to work, just because by the look of it, if someone spends 5 or 6 years in education, we would think that this is higher education. But it's not necessarily a direct correlation then. They're actually, these two patterns, strictly speaking, are not correlated, but they're related. So what I look at in this graph, so what I'm presenting is how education and employment pathways related to educational attainment at age 26. And so the blue color is for higher education, which is degree or other equivalent of degree, which is vocational training of level 4 and above. Then there is medium education, so everything above GCSE and below what we call the higher education. And the lower education is GCSE or lower level. So gradually, if we go from the bottom of this graph, so we see that the proportion of people, like the distribution of educational level at age 26 does not differ that much between those who successfully enter the labor market straight after the age of 16 and those who spend some more time in precarity. But there is still a proportion of those who actually are highly educated by age 26, which means that this is the small proportion who actually profited from entering the labor market and then somehow getting training, online training, or evening degree or something else. So the higher education to full-time job, we see that in this cluster, there's almost 80% of people actually highly educated. And what is interesting that in the next two clusters, what I call higher education to uncertainty or education to uncertainty, we see that it's actually not all of them are highly educated, which means that these are either dropouts from the higher education, or because just generally longest time spent in education without necessarily resulting in the increase in educational level. And the last two classes, the prolonged studies, are also those people who spend longer in education, but even by age 26, we know that 50% of them are still at education. So they might come up to higher proportion of highly educated later on, but not at the moment. And those who are in precarious cycle of unemployment and inactivity are mostly those who are low educated or medium educated. And on the next slide, I'm just adding a bit on the right, which is an interesting dimension. And I mentioned at the beginning that we know that males and females trajectories differ in regards to whether they had children or not. And this was interesting to see the proportion of children actually in each of these clusters, and whether that tells us a little bit more about what we see behind the strict gender differences or behind the parental background differences. So on average, in each cohort, the proportion hasn't changed almost at all. So around 15% of men and 35% of women in each cohort actually had a child by the age of 26. And you see that the dramatic differences is in the first cluster, so the cycle of unemployment and inactivity, that 86% of women in this cluster actually had a child. So we see that these are potentially those women who are in extremely precarious situation, that they had to take care after the family, and but they didn't have a degree or they didn't have a steady job, and therefore they moved out of the labor market. And this is kind of like an alarming thing here that I will discuss later, that this is this precarious situation among women. And it's also higher among those who are in precarious school-to-work trajectory. So I need to move on so that we have some time for questions. So the second question was, what is the association between these trajectories and occupational outcomes? And we see that there is a direct association there. So we see that routine and manual occupation, so nearly all clusters are less likely to be in routine and manual occupation compared to the successful school-to-work trajectory. Which tells us a lot that those people who spend longer time or can't find a job in between, their chances are not that great even to have a job. So this is this protracted transition that has been unsuccessful, for example, among those who are precarious, who follow the precarious rapid school-to-work transition. And what we see is as well that, and not surprisingly, but this is the new pattern that emerged among the youngest cohorts. So those who spend longer time in education and those who finish education and then enter the time of uncertainty of part-time employment or self-employment, they actually have much larger chances to be out of the labor market rather than those who successfully transition to labor market, which means that they might still be in education or they might be looking for a job, but kind of their return to education is less straightforward. In terms of professional managerial occupation, we still see the replication of the classic pattern of those who successfully went into higher education and entered the labor market. Straight after the degree, they have much higher probability of being in professional managerial occupation. And coming to the last question is how these occupation outcomes differ by the level of education. So this is where we include the level of education in the model and look at the interaction effects between education and gender, education and parental background, and education and cohort. So first, when we look at women, we see that, so on the top of it, so this is the outcomes of the model without the interaction effects. So, and where we see there that women were less likely to be, to end up in routine and manual occupation, but more likely to be in intermediate occupation. And the desegregation by levels of education actually didn't tell us that much. But what we don't see is, for example, that for highly educated, so there is no difference in the outcomes of professional managerial education. And that is interesting because this is already controlled for having a child. So without controlling for having a child, this results will be different. Yes, this interaction effect in general is not significant, but women are less likely to be in routine occupation. And then when we look at probabilities for among the cohorts, so there was no difference between the middle cohort and the older cohorts, but the youngest cohort looked different in terms of they have low probability of being in routine or manual occupation and intermediate occupation, but they have high probability of still looking for a job or being out of labor force. And this is also interesting because it refers us back to what we've seen in the education and employment pathways. And this kind of a huge dramatic difference that we see in observed in the youngest cohort. And by parental background, so I'm trying to wrap it up, we started a little bit later. So by the parental background, the intermediate class, as you see, the Rowe model results did not differ significantly from the service class, which is a reference. But there are some significant differences in the working class among the young adults from working class background or from workless background, and yet they have way lower chances of being in professional and managerial occupation even after controlling for education, which means that knowing that more young people from disadvantaged background actually go into higher education, and there's been an increase in the proportion of those who go into higher education or further education even among the workless families as well. But that does not necessarily lead to better professional outcomes. And I'll discuss in the discussion section why we think that happens. But they have still higher proportion of being, they have higher probability of following the routine and manual occupation. So it's the similar picture for, as you see, for both the workless and working class backgrounds. And wrapping it up, sorry if I rushed it again. I tend to do it, but I hope you still will take the take-home messages from this talk. So the discussion pointed by the trajectories and the answer to the questions like accelerated pathways from school to work have remained the most prevalent among young people in the UK. And with more than 50% of men and 40% of women following the traditional rapid school to work transitions. But what we've seen that these transitions have become more complex, and these rapid school to work transitions can also be successful and less successful with longer time spent in education and juggling between different states. And longer time spent in education does not necessarily lead to an increase in the level of qualifications, which poses further question whether could we really think about longer time spent in education as a strategy to avoid unemployment or inactivity? And what we observed as well, that these periods of temporary uncertainty, these juggling between part-time, full-time and self-employment and unemployment has become an integral part of school-to-work trajectories among the youngest cohorts. Occupational outcomes are linked to individual education employment trajectories, but the magnitude of these effects are altered by gender and parental background. And yet when we think about parental background, we see that there is a persistence of patterns of disadvantage over time among young people from less advantaged backgrounds. And this is something that I put here: once in a low pay, no pay cycle, forever there. So this is what we're talking about, this 13% of people who actually have not experienced any kind of stability in the labor market. And the last point here is refers to the gender inequality that we observe, especially among young mothers. And there is a report from the Young Women Trust, which is called Young Female and Forgotten. And I really like how they put it, because it talks exactly about young women who haven't, and especially from low educated or less advantaged backgrounds, who actually, unlike men, they fail in successful rapid school to work transitions. So they don't go into education and they don't go into full-time employment, and they kind of like stuck in this level, in this cycle of unemployment, inactivity. And then once they have a child, they stuck in it for a really long time. And the last discussion point, and I'm wrapping up, is we've seen an increase in the proportion of highly educated young people from less advantaged backgrounds, but yet we don't see much improvement in labor market outcomes. And this is a long, ongoing discussion. So why is this the case? And there could be different factors behind that. There could be, for example, pre-university educational achievements and the fact that they acquire, that potentially young people from more advantaged backgrounds, they acquire different skills of dealing with studies and progressing through a degree. That could also be linked to educational aspiration and cultural background, and the fact that young people from less advantaged backgrounds don't actually believe that they might have a success after education. They go into education, but they don't know how to deal with it afterwards, and they lack some interpersonal skills, potentially, or social networks. And there could be a whole range of other reasons there. So this is just a few arguments that I've collected from the recent literature. And with that said, we still have a little bit of time for discussion, and thank you all so much for being with me. The traditional acknowledgement is to the funding that I had from ESRC and to the data provider. So thank you very much, and I hope you have some questions for me.